Hi guys, my name is Zach Martin. Thank you for coming to my presentation, and I am doing my presentation on human trafficking. And I hope by the time we end this presentation today that you'll have good information to pass along to your fellow law enforcement officers. And also here we have a couple of handouts that you guys can get at the end of the presentation for you to also give to your local law enforcement officers. So, human trafficking makes over $100 billion a year, second to only illegal drug trafficking. And this money is used to support gangs, the cartel, and even terrorism. And as you can see on this map, human trafficking is very prevalent in our country. Now, having said that, we don't really have an exact estimate on how many victims there actually are. But what we do know is that there is over 168,000 texts, emails, and even calls to the national hotline. Of the 20.9 million victims of human trafficking globally, 68% of them are trapped into forced labor, including sex. Over half of them are women and girls, and even over a quarter of them are actually children. Now, we see victims everywhere. We see them, at a hospital, at a school, or even just randomly walking around on the streets. And including in being law enforcement, you guys see a lot more victims than sometimes even the average person does. Now, at the end of this presentation, we should be able to recognize the prevalence it has in our country, be able to identify victims and perpetrators, learn about the efforts in South Carolina, and just be an advocate for more resources to help victims. Human trafficking today is basically modern slavery. It's happening everywhere, even in the United States, and it doesn't matter what nationality you are, gender, religion, doesn't matter. And any person under the age of 18 can be involved in a commercial sex act. So what's really considered commercial sex act? So basically, it's sex or pornography in exchange for anything of value, such as, the big ones here are, money, food, and shelter. But it can even be drugs or even clothes. So what is labor trafficking? And this can be a person who voluntarily comes over to this country and is willing, or they're just straight up forced into it. So some of the businesses that might be involved with human trafficking are bars, farms, clubs, and even one of the bigger ones is actually massage parlors. So now that you know a little bit about the crime itself, let's talk about the victims. And a victim, like I said before, can be any race, age, gender, nationality, religion. It doesn't matter. It can be anybody. And victims, kind of the common age that victims kind of go into trafficking is between 14 to 16. And even smaller children are forced as child soldiers, labor, forced labor, or commercial sex acts. Now, here are some of the risk factors for some types of victims. And the first one is prior sexual abuse, and that is basically, if a victim has a history of sexual abuse, that they can be victimized over and over and over again. Runaway or being homeless, and a lot of times with them is they're just that desperation, and they go to prostitution, and which can make them a victim. Immigrants, so this can be, they're coming over here thinking that they're going to have an awesome life over here, an awesome job, but they end up getting into a debt that they can't pay off. And a lot of times, their traffickers will even take their visas away from them. So here's some of the warning signs of a victim, and firstly is physical abuse, and this can be just random bruises, laceration, cuts, doesn't matter. School absences, so this can be, not just not there every once in a while. This can be weeks or even months at a time that they're not in school. Next is dress, and this can be a young lady who, at first dresses very appropriate for her age, very, modest, and then all of a sudden she starts dressing very provocatively, very, just, not how you saw her before. Next is sleeping in class. This isn't, every once in a while you see a kid sleeping in class. This is they're sleeping all the time, and that's because they might be exhausted from working late at night. Next, personality changes, and this can be, a student might be very open, very talkative, and then all of a sudden they become very, drawn back, very depressed, and there's some very notable personality changes. Next is money, and especially with, schools, a teacher might be, very familiar with some of their students' financial situations, and if they know that, they are a little bit on the poorer side, and then all of a sudden they just have a lot of money, just a notable change like that. Next, obviously being homeless, that's kind of self-explanatory. And the last one might be a little bit unusual, but an older boyfriend, and this can be not even a boyfriend, this can be just an older man that's just very much in control of their actions, maybe not letting them hang out with friends, family, stuff like that. Now that you know a little bit about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators, such as the buyers and the traffickers. The traffickers work on the concept of supply and demand. They demand the profits, and they're getting their revenue from the buyers. And as you can see up here, they could be strangers, family members, friends, and honestly, the most notable one is a boyfriend. Like I said before, they may not even be their actual boyfriend, and here are some of the positions in the trafficking ring. Firstly is the recruiter, and they're the ones that kind of come in and lure the victims in. Next we have the travel agent, and they're the ones just arranging the travel arrangement from one place to another. Next we have the document thief or forger, and this person might either steal or create fake visas, fake passports, whatever. Next you have the employer, and that is the trafficker. That's kind of the boss man. And lastly is the enforcer, and a lot of times this is the person who just basically keeps the victims in line. Some of the common trafficking groups can be either international or local gangs, and a lot of times they use the same routes for their drugs, guns, and obviously people. Next, family operations, and that is you may have one family member in one country, one in the other, and this just makes it easier for them to travel from one place to another. And lastly, independent businesses, and this can be, a bar, a club, or just, some executive wanting to bring some girls in for a Super Bowl party, maybe. Next we're going to talk about the human trafficking control cycle, and there's 3 stages of this, and that is recruitment, initiation, and indoctrination. And so how do traffickers kind of find their victims? And the main way they do this is social media, the internet, whatever. A lot of times they'll use an intimate relationship, such as being a boyfriend or marriage, and they'll offer them like money, expensive gifts, just stuff like that. And in the human trafficking control cycle, initiation will use isolation, drugs, branding, and this can be a tattoo, and even gang rape. And with indoctrinations, a lot of times victims will become traffickers or even enforcers themselves. So here are the buyers. So basically they're the ones who purchase the sex act, labor or sex act. They're the ones that fuel the industry. They're the ones bringing in the money to the traffickers. And unfortunately 99% of these people are males between the age of 18 to 71, and the common age is around 40. And social media is the main conduit that they use to get their victims as well. So here, out of 134 cases, 26% of these people serve no time, and 69% of them have reduced sentences, so they spend about an average of 1.5 years. So now that you know about the victims, about the traffickers and the buyers, let's talk about some of the efforts that are being made in South Carolina. So this is Justin Benzing, And so basically he got caught trying to buy a 14-year-old girl to use as basically a sex slave. And he ended up getting caught in Greenville, South Carolina. And when law enforcement officers made contact, they ended up finding out from him that after he was done using her as a sex slave, that he was going to end up eating her. And he is actually out on bond right now awaiting his trial. So, in 2012, South Carolina created their Human Trafficking Task Force. And, some of the improvements that they have made are stiffer penalties, criminal liability for business owners, civil action and restitution for victims, asset forfeiture by convicted traffickers. And as you can see here, South Carolina has a C grade average, and it's actually even closer to a D. And so some of the reasons for this C is they don't really have a mandatory training for human trafficking for their law enforcement officers. They don't allow wiretapping, which makes sting operations very difficult. They don't have a clear authorization to investigate the crimes over the internet. And they have to report a missing child, but if they end up getting a victim and if they don't prosecute in a certain amount of time, they actually have to delete that file and it's lost forever. So now that we've learned about the victims, the traffickers, the buyers, the efforts being made in South Carolina, let's talk about what can you do as an individual to advocate for human trafficking. Here are some of the federal education efforts that are being made across the country, and the first one is the Department of Homeland Security Blue Campaign, Shared Hope International, and Polaris. So here are some of the people who come into most contact with the victims, and that is firstly law enforcement, obviously, medical personnel, educators such as teachers, and even social services and foster care. So in the medical field, where they kind of see the most people are in their ERs, primary care physicians, and even the OBGYNs. And maybe some of the reasons that a victim might not come forward might be fear, shame, maybe they can't even speak English, and maybe they even might be they might have limited unsupervised time by their enforcer. And some of the reasons that a forced labor victim might come in might be, they might have a physical illness or even a chronic illness. Now when it comes to the sex acts, it might be sexually transmitted disease or even abortions. From the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, 1 out of 6 runaways reported were child sex trafficking victims. Of those, 86% were in the care of social services or foster care. So I guess here are some of the, public services that people do for human trafficking. I guess the first one is called Truckers Against Trafficking, or TAT. And they have trained 5,000 of their truckers to be able to or if they want to be able to see if there's a victim or even the traffickers themselves. And they actually reported on, I think, 500 cases that they reported on. Not sure or not if any of those were, looked into more closely, but they did report 500 of those. Now, here are some of the support systems for victims in South Carolina, and the first one is called Operation Freedom Awareness in Greenville. Next is called Switch in Greenville and in Spartanburg, and both of these provide vouchers for free hotels, clothes, and food. And the last one is called Jasmine Road, and this is a 10-bed shelter. Is set to open in Greenville in spring of 2018, and I'm not sure if it's open right now or if it's very, very soon when that opens. So here are some of the documents that I have that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. And the first one is basically just it's called Human Trafficking 101. And this is just basically some more information on human trafficking itself. And next we have basically some human trafficking terms, and human trafficking have their own, traffickers and buyers have their own little lingo of what they say and talk about over social media or even text messages, and this is just kind of some terms that would be good for you to know. Continued presence visa, and basically what that is if you have a victim and you think that they're illegal, that you can provide this document saying that, just to give them a little bit of hope that they're not just going to get thrown out of the country. And this is useful because, if you lose them, you may not have your key witness to stop a human trafficking ring itself. And then lastly, I also have just printed out PowerPoint presentation. And then I also have here the link to a video that that doesn't quite work right now, but there's a link here, and so you can go to it if you want to look at it later. Lastly, this is the human trafficking hotline number, and whether if you're law enforcement or if you're just a regular person out on the street, if you see any signs of somebody being a victim or you think somebody might be a trafficker or a buyer, please call this number, and you just might save somebody's life by calling it. And here are some of the references that I've had throughout my presentation. I have quite a few of them. And obviously here is the video that I can't quite get to work here. But like I said before, there's a link before, and if you want to take a look at it, it's right there. Thank you, and do you guys have any questions?